Just Talk with Trent here, 888-318-7884. Maybe you have left the Catholic Church. Maybe you have never even considered entering the Catholic Church. And it might even strike you as a silly question, but it's the question we ask this hour. Why aren't you a Catholic? 888-318-7884. Already, folks calling to let us know why they're not Catholic. So we'll start with Ricky in Bellevue, Nebraska, listening on Catholic.com. Ricky, we're glad you're here. Why aren't you Catholic?
Hey, guys. Appreciate you taking my call. I'm not Catholic currently, at least at the moment. I'm kind of in the analysis paralysis section of my investigation. But, Trent, very honored to talk with you. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while. I wish I had an hour or two to talk to you to pick your brain about this. But
sure. We'll make the best use of our time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, my question actually is in relation to the recent debate that you just did, which commend you on. I think you kind of won.
I'll take that.
I can say that. Yeah. I'm not Catholic yet, so I'm trying to give you props. But
well, thank you.
My question was actually in relation to the video you did on Sola Scriptura and the early Christians. I know you went through 15 of the Church Fathers from the 2nd century, and I thought that was a very interesting video, very insightful. And unfortunately, I made the mistake of going to the comment section of that video.
Sure.
And normally, nothing good comes from the comment section, but there was something that stood out to me from a gentleman that you've interacted with before, by the name of Barely Protestant.
Yes, he's an Anglican priest, yeah.
Anglican priest, yeah. And he posed a question that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to ask you and just get your thoughts on it. Based on the line of argumentation that you used from the 2nd century Christians in regards to Sola Scriptura, could not that same line of argumentation be applied to the papacy, since you don't have too much of that, or seemingly too much of that in the 2nd century applied to the primacy of the Bishop of Rome?
Right. So
if that makes sense.
what Barely Protestant, I believe his name is Father Adam, and we've had chats before online. Hopefully, have another one again. And I anticipated something like this might come up. So background to our viewers, I had an argument for the debate with Gavin Ortlund on Sola Scriptura. One of my arguments was an argument from patristic silence, that if the apostles were there, what they left the church was a paradigm of authority found in their writings alone. So in Scripture alone, particularly in their writings alone, that during the time of their ministry, there would have been a paradigm of authority both in their spoken word and in their written word. For example, the Council of Jerusalem was a binding ecumenical council, even though it wasn't recorded in the Acts of the Apostles until at least one decade, and you'll have some scholars saying several decades after that council. So my argument was, if they went from oral, written and unwritten infallible rules to only written, to these and just to these particular documents, you would have expected some kind of attestation to this, especially because you're undergoing a shift, this kind of a paradigm shift. And if the New Testament was the only infallible rule of faith, then we would expect it to be cited a lot more among these early apostolic fathers, and we don't. Now, this is the reply seems to be, well, we don't see certain levels of evidence for the papacy that we would expect during this period. So I guess it's a similar argument from silence. And I guess I could reply to that in one of two ways. One, I might say in this period going up to the time of Irenaeus, we do have, I think we do have good evidence for the papacy, at least especially for the primacy of the Church of Rome, and then eventually on the understanding of that in the Bishop of Rome, in things like the letter of Clement, which I did cite in my video, where Clement, and now I think when Clement was writing First Clement was probably in the late 60s. This was when Clement, before he was Pope, but he was kind of the corresponding secretary for the church at Rome. It might have even been before another elder was selected to be the overseer of the church at Rome, or to be the bishop of Rome. And he settled there. We have the Roman church is sought out to settle a dispute in Corinth, even though probably the Apostle John was still alive at this point and living nearby to respond to the issue. So things like the letter of Clement, the actions of Pope Victor I at the end of the first century. I think there is good evidence for an authoritative church and for the role of the Bishop of Rome in particular. So I guess that might be the one route I would go at, is disputing the claim that there is insufficient evidence or a silence of the evidence. I don't think that that's the case, though I do think there is a developing recognition of the authority of the overseer of the Church of Rome, or the Bishop of Rome. There's very early evidence the Church of Rome has unique authority. We see this in the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch. We see this in Clement. The thing is, what's happening here is that in the first century, the offices of bishop, priest, and deacon are somewhat fluid. Like you have Paul, for example, calling himself a deacon, and Peter calling himself an elder. Once the office of apostle, when the church recognized, no longer existed, then there is a transition and an understanding of the role of the bishop that takes time to recognize. Though the argument that I'm making is that, and I'm fine with the church kind of recognizing the role of Scripture, though I think it would probably be a bit more immediate if the apostles were planning to give that to the church. So the other route I would go in responding to this kind of argument is to say that we should not be alarmed by there not being as much patristic explicit citations of the papacy. Rather, I think we should just take a step back and look at all of the evidence. And so we look at, okay, what did the early church find to be authoritative? Well, primarily it was the leaders of the church who were the successors of the apostles. That's where you went to find Christ's church. That's the authority you cited. And then in a secondary way, you also have the scriptures, primarily the Old Testament, but in some cases the New Testament. So for me, I think if I was just to take a big step back to say, all right, well, if I look at this, sola scriptura wasn't the paradigm. It seems to be scripture, tradition, and the magisterium. And then the nature of what we mean by the magisterium, that it's the successors of the apostles, there's a growing awareness and recognition of that the unique role of Peter was passed on to his successor. Now, I know a Protestant might object to that and say, well, then there was a growing recognition of the canon of Scripture, and I agree with that as well. But I would say that if they try to clamp down and say that the papacy was not something that is part of the deposit of faith because of a lack of this source or that source, they're going to end up sawing off the branch that they're sitting on when it comes to saying that the canon of Scripture, for example, is one infallible rule of faith, if not the infallible rule of faith. So I would say there is evidence for the papacy in the 2nd century, and I would dispute the claim that the amount of evidence we have is insufficient to justify it being a part of the deposit of faith. I don't think my argument for silence when it dealt with sola scriptura, I don't think it can be imported against the papacy in the same way. But I gave you a kind of lengthy response. We do have to go to a break here, but was that at least a helpful start?
It was. If I could ask, is there an article on Catholic Answers, or maybe you could point me to why, because I've heard that argument before about Clement. Is there anywhere you could point me in the direction of why you think Clement was written earlier than in the 90s?
Yeah, I tell you what, Ricky, if you stay on the line and give our call screener your email, I'll send you those resources as well as my book, Case for Catholicism, and then I send you a bit more on those subjects. Would that work?
I actually have your book, The Case for Catholicism, and I've read it. So thank you for that. But
I'll send you another book. Maybe I'll send you. You know what? I could send you an advanced release of When Protestants Argue Like Atheists. You can get it before everybody else.
Oh, very nice. All right, coming your way. I got it right here, Trent. When Protestants Argue Like Atheists, I got it on the desk because we're going to talk about it in a little bit. Trent Horn's our guest. Ricky, hang on the line. We'll get your information so Trent can send you materials, and we'll be right back